Good evening. We are going to continue our study on the character of Joseph, and tonight I want to talk about Joseph as a servant, because we know that he was a servant and a slave of Potiphar and of Pharaoh, and I think that we can relate that in our servanthood and in our relationship with God. So that's how I want to look at that tonight. So that's where we're going to start. Is being a servant is what a disciple of Jesus is called to be. This is our calling. This is who we are to be as Christians. We are to be servants of God. And that's not telling you anything you don't know. And I think that all would agree with that we know we are to serve God and that we are to be His servants and His slaves. And Jesus stressed this point in several different occasions. In Matthew the 23rd chapter, verses 8 through 12, it says, "But you do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ. And you are all brethren. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, He who is in heaven. And do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. But he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. And whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." So Jesus points out the faults of the scribes and the Pharisees here, that we are called to be a servant, that he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. And then he talks about humility, which we're going to get into in a little bit. Also, during the Last Supper, his vivid demonstration of servitude. When he washes the disciples' feet in John the 13th chapter, verses 12 through 17, it says, "So when he had washed their feet, taking his garments, and sat down again, he said to them, 'Do you know what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them.'" So he points out the servanthood, and he stresses the truth that is us being a servant of God to his disciples when he washes their feet. And he says, "I've set an example for you. I washed your feet, so you should wash one another's feet." And even by his own example, as Christ, of course, came to the earth to serve. We read in Matthew the 20th chapter, in verse 25 through 28, it says, "But Jesus called them to himself and said, 'You know that the ruler of the Gentiles, Lord, is over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many.'" So Jesus points out that those who desire to become great become a servant, and whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. Just as Jesus came to earth, not to be served, but to serve. He came to the earth to be a servant, just as we see in Joseph, as he was a servant to both Potiphar and Pharaoh, and the people of Egypt, for that fact. So these are some things that we can really learn from how Joseph lived his life and the servanthood that he showed to those that he served. Even whenever he was in the jail, and they put all those that were in the jail were in Joseph's authority, he still served them, and he still served the jailer. And I want us to understand that we're specifically called to serve God, first of all. In James, the first chapter, in verse 1, it says, "James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greetings." Now, this is James just opening his letter, and we can look at many different examples of other disciples. Paul, of course, being one of them, always saying often that he's a bondservant of God, and James pointing it out here that we are bondservants, that we're servants of God, and that's what we're called to be. And he points out as well in James the first chapter that we're to serve Jesus Christ as well. And he picks that Paul picks that up in 1 Corinthians the fourth chapter in verse 1. Let a man so consider us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. So we're called to be servants. So many times, these are just very few examples that I'm pointing out here, but we're called so oftentimes to be servants of God, of Jesus Christ. In Romans the 6th chapter, and starting in verse 17 and verse 18, it says, "But God be thanked that though you were slaves of sin, yet you obeyed from the heart that formed of doctrine to which you were delivered, and have been set free from sin, you became slaves of righteousness." So we're also to serve righteousness. We're to live right, to do right, to act right, to be righteous people. That's what God calls us to be, and that's what part of being a servant to Him and to Jesus Christ is going to be called, that we're going to be a slave and we're going to be a servant of righteousness as well. And in Galatians the 5th chapter, in verse 13, it says, "For you, brethren, have been called to liberty. Only do not use liberty as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." So we're also called to serve each other. We are to serve our brethren and do anything that we can to help and be servants one to another. Just as Jesus, whenever he was washing the feet of his disciples, he was serving them, just as Joseph served Potiphar and Pharaoh, and again the people of Egypt. The love that is showed there. This is who we're called to be as servants. We are called to be servants to God, to Christ, to righteousness, and of course to each other. And I think that that's something, unfortunately, we all too often forget, that we are to be servants of one another. And sometimes that's hard. But that doesn't negate the fact that that's what we're called to do. So this is one of the big things that we can learn from who Joseph was and the example that he left us, that he was a servant. The early Christians called themselves servants oftentimes, as again, going back to the way that the disciples opened up a lot of their letters to various churches and one another. They call themselves servants or bondservants because that's what they were. This is who they were. This is the person that they knew they were supposed to be. They were servants. But what is so good about being a servant? For one thing, being a servant is a mark of spiritual maturity, and I think that that's something that we all strive to do. We all strive to be spiritually mature, and that's something we all try to attain for, is it not? An immature person is usually very selfish. And I've said this many a time, especially recently to my wife, that if we could get rid of selfishness in the world, if we could get rid of self-centeredness in the world and get more servanthood and get more of being a servant one to another, we would solve a lot of the world's problems. But the immature person is very selfish and very focused upon what's good for them and how everything is going to be better for them and how it's going to plan out for them. Not about how they can serve others or serve God, but how it's going to end up benefiting them in some way. For example, of course, this is one we like to bring up. Newborn babies are very selfish, but they don't know that, but it's all about them. They want to eat at a certain time, they want to be changed at a certain time, and they want to sleep at a certain time, and they're going to make sure that you know that that's something that they want. Normally, of course, as people grow older, we begin to concern ourselves and with the needs of other people, with the needs of our spouse, with the needs of our family, of the elderly, of the young kids that that we're there to help, and we need to again look at this servanthood that we are called to be servants. And as we grow older, of course, this is something that comes with maturity, both spiritually and in the worldly sense, that we think about other people more than we think about ourselves as we mature. And if we do this, of course, if we think about other people and consider what other people need, that's the mark of maturity. We're becoming mature. We're becoming spiritually mature and mature as an individual. But if we remain selfish and self-centered, and we remain focused upon what we want and what benefits us only, this is an indication of immaturity. This is an indication that we are stunting our growth, that we're not maturing and becoming more studied and just a proper person, being, again, for lack of a better term, not to repeat myself, but being mature. So, a person who serves others is certainly not selfish. When you're taking the time to think about others and what other people need and how you can be of service to them, it takes time away from thinking about what I want. So when we serve others, we take away that self-centeredness. And we become concerned with the needs of other people, how we can serve. And this is a question, I think, that throughout this study of servanthood that we're looking at, of course, from Joseph's perspective, of how he served so many in the story that we've kind of gone over. Serving, of course, Potiphar and Pharaoh, but not only them, but the butler and the baker. When he was in prison, he served them, and he served the jailer because he was over the entire jail. And of course, these are all blessings because of God, but understand that Joseph was a servant, and he did it proper. So a person who serves others, therefore demonstrates mature behavior. We show that we're mature when we are serving other people. And I think that we can come to that conclusion about Joseph, that he served others and did so well. Are we trying to be servants of God? That's a question to ask yourself daily. Are you trying to be a servant of God and of His Son, the Lord Jesus Christ? If so, we're on the road to spiritual maturity. Again, something that I think all of us are trying to attain. That we're always trying to mature in the Word and properly study and apply these what God has given us to our lives, and living a better Christian life and reaching those that are lost and serving others and reaching that spiritual maturity. But before we consider too quickly, before we answer too quickly, let's consider a couple things. Being a servant has several implications. It implies absolute obedience. In a slave-master relationship, the slave knows no laws but the master's law. And we look at Joseph, we look at the story of Joseph and how he obeyed the law of God, and how he focused upon God, and how God blessed him throughout his entire life in his slavery, really, especially, but also how he served Potiphar. Potiphar, it says that Potiphar put him over all that he had, and he had no concern but besides the food that he ate. He didn't care about much else because he knew it was being taken care of, because Joseph was being a proper servant, a proper slave. And with Pharaoh as well, Joseph gave much advice whenever it came to telling him, interpreting his dream, and preparing for the time of famine. Whenever they had the 7 years of plenty, they prepared. So that was being a good servant and a good slave. So the slave-master relationship, the slave knows no law but the master's. So again, most importantly, Joseph showed that he put God first. But the slave also, in the slave-master relationship, the slave has no right of his own. He's only concerned with what his master needs. And that's what we should be concerned with as Christians. Not concerned with every minute little thing, but what pleases God? And what am I to be doing in my life? And this can go through several, so many different aspects of your life. What am I doing in my life to show that I'm a servant, to show that I'm a slave of God's? In every aspect of your life, in your family life, in your work life, in the time that you spend with friends, are you showing that you have that slave-master relationship with God, and that you are His servant? That the slave is an absolute possession of the master, that we are God's possession. He owns us. When we've given our life to Him, that's what we're signing up for. We are signing up to give our lives to Him. And what a wonderful way, and what a wonderful blessing. And the blessings we enjoy in life are because of this, because we've given our lives to Him. So, and the slave is bound to give the master unquestioning obedience. This is exactly how Joseph obeyed his masters, and exactly the way that we, as servants of God, as His children, and His slaves, for lack of better term, are to be giving Him unquestioning obedience. We are never to question God. And that's not shocking to you. But do we do it? Do we think about, maybe sometimes we do question God? And I hope that we don't, and we catch ourselves and understand that we don't need to be doing that, because as a servant of God, we are to be giving Him unquestioning obedience. So does this describe your relationship to Jesus Christ, and with Jesus Christ, and with God? Does this describe the relationship that you have, and that you say that you have, and that you profess to have? Do you check off this list? Do you go through and say, I have no other law but my master's law, and that there is that I don't have rights of my own. I only belong to my Father, and I give Him unquestioning obedience in everything that I am told. These are hard things to do, but these are things we are called to do. So does this describe your relationship with Jesus Christ? Because in 1 Corinthians, the 6th chapter, and verse 19 and 20, it says, "Or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own? For you were bought at a price. Therefore glorify in your body and in your spirit, which are God's." So it should describe our relationship with Christ, especially in light of this verse, that we are that our body is the temple, and that we have been bought with a price. There's been a price paid for each and every one of us, and we know what that price is. We know that price is Jesus Christ, and we say that often, but do we take it to heart and understand what that means, and understand that we are to be servants, and that we are to be absolutely obedient to Him? In Luke, the 6th chapter, and verse 46, "But why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things which I say?" I think that all of us have been caught in this at one time, and we read this verse and it catches you off guard, and kind of punches you in the heart a little bit. But we have to come to Jesus on His terms, not our own. We have to be absolutely obedient to Him. So being a servant implies absolute obedience. It also implies absolute humility. Otherwise, absolute obedience is not possible. If we don't humble ourselves, we can't be obedient. And this is something I think that, again, that we see in the character of Joseph, that he was humble. That he didn't become puffed up in these different positions that he had of great power, of being, a slave, and then being the head of Potiphar's household, and the head of the jail, and the head of Egypt, really governing Egypt for Pharaoh at the end of the story. So he could have been very puffed up, but he stayed humble and was still obedient, and still had the proper servant attitude. When we have a humble opinion of ourselves, we we are receptive to the idea of complete obedience. If we humble ourselves, and that's the view that we have of ourselves, it's going to be much easier to be completely and absolutely obedient to whom we are serving. So consider Paul's self-estimation in 1 Corinthians, the 15th chapter, in verses 9 and 10. For I am the least of the apostles, who am not worthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. But I labored more abundantly than they all, yet not I, but the grace of God, which was with me. Paul says, I shouldn't even be an apostle. For I am the least of the apostles, and I am not worthy to be called an apostle. Paul's showing his humility here. And this is the example that we're given. And Paul also writes in Ephesians, the 3rd chapter, in verse 8, to me who am less than the least of all the saints, this grace was given, that I should preach among the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ. I love the way that Paul puts that. To me, who am less than the least of all the saints, I am below the least. That's what Paul's saying. So consider the humility that's being shown here, and the humility shown by Joseph. For sake of our class, that's where we're focusing. But we can take this away and really put this into work in our lives by the example that was given by Joseph. And that, again, that is the whole point and theme of the class that we're doing here. So does this describe our relationship with Christ and his will? Again, asking the same question. So when we're talking about absolute humility, do the examples that were given by Paul and what he said, does this describe our relationship with Jesus Christ and the will that Jesus Christ has for us? Jesus said it should in Luke the 17th chapter and verse 10. So likewise you, when you have done all these things which are commanded, say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done what was our duty to do. We've done it. We have become servants, and this is what we are to do. So Jesus said that this should show our relationship. We should be servants, and we should be absolutely humble in the way that we carry ourselves. But if we murmur or complain, about what Jesus tells us to do, can we be considered servants? I'll leave you with that question on the note of absolute humility. So, being a servant implies that we have absolute obedience. We are absolutely humble, absolute humility, and it also implies absolute loyalty. Since we become servants freely, we make that choice to become a servant of God. It should be expected that we are loyal to him first. In Galatians, the 1st chapter, in verse 10, it says, for do I not persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if I still pleased men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. We're not called to please men. We're not called to make sure that they are taken care of, that we're loyal to them. We are called to be loyal to Christ, and we're called in Galatians, the 1st chapter, we would not be a bondservant of Christ if we're serving men. So, we are called to be his servants, and we are called to be absolutely loyal to him. Do not consider our own profit or preference important, is what I should say. So don't consider our own preference important, but that which is the one we freely serve. We should be concerned with what pleases God and what profits him and what we should be doing to serve him. This is what we should be concerned with. But think about this. Isn't it amazing how anyone can claim to be a servant of the Lord Jesus Christ? Anyone can call themselves a servant or a follower, a bond servant, a slave of Jesus Christ, while they're complaining about what they have to do to align their life with the will of God. And again, I think that's something that all of us have fallen into the trap of. And being negligent or lazy in carrying out the will of God. But some act as though they're being forced against their own will. I'm being forced to do this, and I don't really want to. This is something being forced. And understand that we're the ones that made the decision to be a servant, to be a slave, to do the will of God. We're the ones that made that decision. And we know why we did. The abundant blessings that we have, and ultimately a home in heaven with God because of it. But do we have the proper attitude, and are we showing that we're loyal to God in the way that we're living our lives, in the way that we're conducting ourselves? Or are we acting as though we're being forced against our own will to do the things of God? Because we don't have to serve God. This physical man, we have a choice that we can make. That's what I mean. Of course, the alternative is very inviting. The serving this physical body is very inviting. We get to pursue the lust of the eye, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. I think about Joseph and Potiphar's wife. And he could have pursued that if he wanted to. He was a good-looking man, and I'm sure that she was a good-looking woman, and she wanted him, and she kept trying to seduce him, and he could have succumbed to that. He could have laid down with her, but he didn't. So the alternative to serving God can be very inviting and very simple, and that's kind of more the point I guess I'm trying to make, is that it can be very simple and very easy to do. We don't have to do a whole lot of thinking. We just simply do what comes naturally. And that's never a good thing. But if we don't serve Jesus, there is an alternate way. We don't have to, right? We have a decision to make. And if we decide that we don't want to serve Jesus, by default, we are going to serve Satan. And then we have our destiny. We have where we're going. We're destined for hell if we do that. Let that sink in. I think that, at least for myself, I don't think about that often enough. And I hope I don't have to think about it often enough, but that should be something that crosses our mind, that if we're not serving Jesus, then we are serving the devil, because we're serving something. But God, by His grace, offered salvation. And I'll give you this thought, that how dare we ever grumble or complain or whine or whatever, however you want to put that He calls us to be servants, and that we're called to live a life of gratitude and a life of servanthood, and being and serving Him, serving righteousness, serving others, serving Jesus Christ with what we've been given and what we've been promised. How can you do that? So, those are some implications of being called a servant. And it is a costly in terms of service, of our pride and our allegiance, and what we're doing. It can be costly, but also consider that being a servant is a great honor. And I'm just going to give you a couple verses here. I'm not going to read them for sake of time, but far from being a title of dishonor, it was the title, that being a servant, it was a title by which the greatest men of the Old Testament were known. In Deuteronomy, the 9th chapter, verse 27, He calls Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob thy servant. In 1 Kings, the 8th chapter, in verse 53, he calls Moses thy servant. In Joshua 24:29, he calls Joshua a servant of the Lord. In Numbers 14:24, he calls Caleb my servant. In Job, the 1st chapter, in verse 8, he calls Job my servant. In Isaiah, the 20th chapter, in verse 3, he calls Isaiah my servant. In Jeremiah, the 7th chapter, in verse 25, he calls the prophets my servants. So, this is a wonderful title and an honorable title that we can take on as Christians, as servants of God. So, how wonderful it would be if God looked upon us as companions of these great men who found freedom, peace, and glory, and found favor in the sight of God, who found it in perfect submission of the will of God. So we will be looked upon as companions of God just as they were, and He will look on us that way if we're willing to accept the call to serve Him and His Son, Jesus Christ. And we are going to serve Him and should serve Him with absolute obedience, with absolute humility, and with absolute loyalty. And when we're serving God, His Son, and even each other, in those manners, in those ways, we are making great strides towards what I talked about at the beginning and being spiritually mature. A servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. Can this be said about us? Because I believe that it can be said about Joseph. And going back to how he showed his servanthood, how he showed to be a servant and a slave of those who were in power over him, in his father even, by Potiphar, by the Egyptians, by Pharaoh, but most importantly, his service to God and the way that God blessed him. And just the things that we see that Joseph enjoyed because he was a servant. So this is something I think that we can take and cling to and really learn a lesson from who Joseph was and understand that we need to be a servant as he was. This is who we are called to be as Christians, servants. Thank you so much for your time.